The morning of September 15th, 1873, found Antoine Roussel bent over his workbench, separating strands of Tibetan yak hair with the patience of a man who understood that hurrying meant ruining. Outside his workshop on Rue Saint-Honoré, Paris was awakening to another day of its slow recovery, the wounds of war and revolution still visible in the scaffolding that embraced half the buildings like concerned relatives. Our wig-maker, for that is what Antoine was, though he preferred the grander title of perruquier, had been at his craft for 24 years, long enough to witness the slow death of his profession. The elaborate court wigs of the previous century had given way to simpler fashions, and now even those were disappearing. Progress, he would mutter to himself, though whether with bitterness or amusement, even he couldn't say. His fingers, stained slightly yellow from years of working with dyes, moved with the unconscious precision of long practice. Each hair had to be cleaned, sorted by length, then carefully matched for color, a task that required the kind of obsessive attention to detail that made most men mad or masters. Antoine had somehow managed to become the latter while retaining enough of the former to make him interesting at dinner parties, though he rarely attended any these days. The workshop itself told the story of a craft in decline. Where once 3 journeymen would have labored alongside him, now there was only young Pierre, 17 years old, and more interested in the baker's daughter across the street than in learning the 37 different knots required for a proper foundation. The boy sat at his own bench, supposedly working on a practice piece, but Antoine could hear the telltale scratching of a pen on paper. Another love letter, no doubt. The master chose not to notice. At 17, he too had believed that love was more important than commerce. "Monsieur Roussel?" Pierre's voice cracked slightly. "There's a gentleman to see you." Antoine looked up to find a liveried servant standing in his doorway, looking distinctly uncomfortable among the heads of faceless wooden forms wearing half-finished wigs. The man's uniform bore the arms of the Montmorency family, azure, a cross, or between 16 Alarions argent. Antoine knew his heraldry. In his business, knowing who was who could mean the difference between payment and promises. "Count Henri de Montmorency requests your immediate presence at Château de Belmont," the servant announced, producing a sealed letter, "for a matter of some delicacy regarding restoration work." The Count de Montmorency. Even in these Republican times when titles were supposedly meaningless, that name carried weight. Antoine broke the seal and read quickly. The commission was for restoration of a collection of 18th century wigs, with additional work as needed. The fee mentioned was enough to cover his brother's medical expenses for 6 months. His brother, Francois, there was a weight that pressed on Antoine's shoulders daily. A master carpenter until a beam fell and crushed his legs 3 years ago, Francois now spent his days in bed while his wife took in washing and their 3 children learned too young what hunger meant. Antoine sent what he could, but what he could send was never quite enough. "Tell the Count I shall arrive tomorrow," Antoine said, already mentally cataloging what he would need to bring. The servant looked relieved to be leaving. Pierre had abandoned all pretense of work and was staring openly. "The Montmorency Chateau? Master, that's 30 kilometers from here." "And thus I shall need you to mind the shop," Antoine replied, though they both knew there was little shop to mind. Their current orders consisted of 2 theatrical wigs for the opera and a hairpiece for Madame Delacroix, who persisted in believing that no one noticed she was balding. "But, master, surely you need an assistant for such important work." The boy's eyes were pleading. Antoine knew that look. It meant Pierre had done something requiring a strategic absence from Paris. "What have you done now?" Antoine sighed. "I may have promised Mademoiselle Fournier that I would commission a portrait of her from her father, as a surprise. Except her father found out and now believes I've made improper advances and—" "Enough!" Antoine raised a hand. Sometimes he wondered if he'd been this foolish at 17. Then he remembered proposing to the milliner's daughter with a wig he'd made from his own hair and decided that, yes, he probably had been. "You'll remain here and fulfill our current orders. If you finish them perfectly by my return, we'll discuss your situation." The workshop fell quiet as Antoine began his preparations. He selected his finest tools, the German scissors that had cost him a month's earnings, the combs made from tortoiseshell that his master had left him, the pressing irons that could coax even the most stubborn hair into submission. Each tool was wrapped carefully in soft leather, a ritual that calmed his mind. Outside, the sounds of Paris continued, the cries of water sellers, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant sound of construction as the city rebuilt itself yet again. Antoine had lived through the Empire, the Restoration, another republic, another empire, and now another republic. Governments rose and fell, but people always needed their vanities tended to. That, at least, was eternal. As he packed, Antoine considered what he knew of the Montmorency family. Old nobility, roots going back to the Crusades. They'd survived the revolution through a combination of tactical absence and strategic marriages. The current count was said to be a scholar and collector, more interested in art than politics. A wise choice in these uncertain times. There were stories about the chateau, of course. There were always stories about old houses with too much history. The most persistent tale concerned a portrait of one of the Count's ancestors, a woman of legendary beauty whose painted hair was said to still grow. Antoine smiled at such foolishness. In his experience, the only things that grew in old paintings were mold and the imagination of bored servants. Still, he made a mental note to examine this portrait if given the chance. One never knew what techniques the old masters might have used, and Antoine was, above all else, a student of his craft. "Master," Pierre ventured, "what if Monsieur Fournier comes looking for me?" "Then I shall be conveniently absent," Antoine replied. "And you shall have to face the consequences of your romantic endeavors like a man." The boy paled, which gave Antoine a small amount of satisfaction. Youth needed to learn that love, like wig-making, required patience, skill, and, occasionally, a strategic retreat. The Château de Belmont revealed itself through the morning mist of September 16th like a grande dame slowly lifting her veil. Antoine, bouncing uncomfortably in the Count's own carriage, a courtesy he hadn't expected, found himself studying the approaching edifice with a craftsman's eye. The building was a testament to 3 centuries of architectural ambition, each generation adding wings and follies according to their taste and fortune. The gravel drive curved through gardens that showed signs of careful maintenance fighting a losing battle against reduced staff. Here, a hedge grown slightly wild. There, a fountain whose Neptune had lost his trident. The war had touched even these privileged spaces, though more gently than it had touched Paris. Count Henri de Montmorency received Antoine in what he called his morning room, though the heavy curtains admitted only enough light to emphasize the dust motes dancing in the air. The Count was 68 years old, but carried himself like a man who had decided that age was merely an inconvenient opinion. His clothes were of excellent quality, but dated, 1850s at the latest, and his gray whiskers were trimmed in a style that Napoleon III might have admired. "Monsieur Roussel," the Count said, rising from behind a desk covered in what appeared to be architectural drawings. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Most comfortable, Your Excellency," Antoine replied, using the old form of address automatically. The Count smiled slightly. Whether in approval or amusement was impossible to say. "I must apologize for the urgency of my summons, but the matter is particular." The Count gestured for Antoine to follow him. "You see, we are preparing for an exhibition. The government," he said the word as one might say tuberculosis, "has requested that certain historic houses open their collections to public view. A gesture of Republican solidarity, they call it." They walked through corridors lined with portraits, each face gazing down with the serene confidence of those who never doubted their place in the world. Antoine noticed that many of the frames showed signs of recent cleaning, bright patches where gilt had been restored. "This is Mademoiselle Dufour, my secretary," the Count said as a woman emerged from a side room. She was 34, Antoine judged, with the kind of sharp intelligence in her eyes that suggested she was the one who actually ran the household. Her dress was severe, practical, but the fabric was excellent. Poor relation, Antoine diagnosed, making herself indispensable. "Monsieur Roussel is here about the wigs," the Count explained. "And not a moment too soon," Mademoiselle Dufour replied. Her voice carried a slight accent, Lyon, perhaps. "Monsieur Laroche has been quite anxious about their condition." "Ah, yes, our curator." The Count's tone suggested complications. "You'll meet him presently. He's very protective of the collection." They entered the portrait gallery proper, and Antoine found himself genuinely impressed. The room stretched the full length of the wing, with tall windows on one side and portraits covering the opposite wall. The morning light, filtered through old glass, gave everything a underwater quality. "The wig collection is through here," the Count said, moving toward a side door. "But first, I thought you might appreciate this." He stopped before a portrait that dominated the center of the main wall. Antoine's first impression was of light. The painted figure seemed to glow against the dark background. The subject was a woman in the style of the First Empire, her dress high-waisted and flowing, her face turned 3/4 toward the viewer. But it was the hair that drew the eye, an elaborate arrangement of curls and waves that seemed to capture actual sunlight. "Madame Celeste de Montmorency," the Count said. "My great-great-aunt died in 1812, renowned as the most beautiful woman of her generation." Antoine stepped closer, his professional interest piqued. The hair in the portrait was remarkable. Each strand seemed individually painted, creating a sense of depth and movement he'd rarely seen. The color was extraordinary too, a rich auburn that seemed to shift subtly as he moved, catching different angles of light. "There's a legend," Mademoiselle Dufour said, and Antoine caught something in her tone, skepticism mixed with unwilling fascination. "They say her hair continues to grow, that it changes color with the seasons." "Servants gossip," a new voice interrupted. A man had entered the gallery, 55 years old, Antoine guessed, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was armor. "Monsieur Laroche, the estate curator," he introduced himself, though his attention remained fixed on the portrait. "The painting is remarkable for its technique, nothing more." Yet Antoine noticed how Laroche's fingers twitched slightly, as if resisting an urge to touch the frame. There was something there, some tension that spoke of more than professional interest. "The wig collection?" Antoine prompted, partly from politeness and partly to break the strange atmosphere that had settled over the group. "Yes, of course." Laroche led them through a door into a smaller chamber, cedar-lined and carefully climate-controlled. 18 pieces in total, dating from 1760 to 1820. Most belonged to the lady in the portrait, actually. She was quite particular about her appearance. The wigs were stored in individual boxes, each labeled in fading ink. Antoine opened the first carefully and immediately saw the problem. The hair was brittle, breaking at the slightest touch. But more interesting was the pattern of damage, not the usual deterioration from age, but something more deliberate, as if someone had been pulling strands from specific sections. "How long have they been in storage?" Antoine asked. "Since Madame Celeste's death," the Count replied, "though they've been examined periodically, for the exhibition, you understand." Antoine understood more than they were saying. These wigs had been handled recently and roughly. He caught Mademoiselle Dufour watching him and realized she knew it too. "I'll need to set up a workspace," Antoine said, "somewhere with good light and ventilation." "The old music room," Mademoiselle Dufour suggested. "It's been closed for years, but has excellent windows." As they discussed arrangements, Antoine found his gaze drawn back to the portrait. There was something about the hair, something beyond mere artistic skill. The way the light played across it seemed almost organic. He made a mental note to examine it more closely when he had the chance. "One more thing," the Count said as they prepared to leave the gallery. "The portrait must not be touched. It's delicate. Previous restoration attempts have been unfortunate." "What kind of attempts?" Antoine asked. The Count and Laroche exchanged glances. "The last was in 1850, Laroche said finally. "A specialist from Paris. He claimed the hair was actually changing, that the paint was somehow alive. Nonsense, of course. The man was clearly disturbed. He left rather suddenly." As they walked back through the gallery, Antoine noticed a young housemaid polishing a frame with unusual concentration. She was pretty in a provincial way, maybe 26, with the kind of careful movements that suggested someone who'd learned that invisibility was a servant's best defense. When she saw them approaching, she curtsied and quickly moved away, but not before Antoine caught her looking at the portrait of Madame Celeste with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That's Marie-Claire," Mademoiselle Dufour explained. "She's been with us for 8 years. Very reliable." The tour concluded in what would be Antoine's workspace. The old music room was perfect. High ceilings, large windows facing north, and enough space for his equipment. As he stood there, mentally arranging his tools and materials, he became aware that he was being watched. Laroche stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "A word of advice, Monsieur Roussel," the curator said quietly. "Some mysteries are better left unexplored. The past has a way of entangling those who dig too deep." Before Antoine could respond, Laroche was gone, leaving only the echo of his footsteps in the corridor and the distinct feeling that the simple wig restoration he'd been hired for was anything but simple. By the morning of September 17th, Antoine had transformed the old music room into something resembling his Paris workshop. The wig stands were arranged along one wall, his tools laid out with military precision on a table he'd commandeered from the servants' hall. The autumn light streaming through the tall windows was perfect, bright enough to work by, soft enough not to damage the delicate materials. The first wig he examined told a story of neglect punctuated by violence. The foundation was silk net, hand-knotted with a skill that made Antoine pause in professional admiration. But someone had been at it recently, pulling hairs from specific sections with enough force to tear the net itself.
The damage wasn't random. It followed a pattern. Always from the crown and temple areas, always the auburn strands rather than the darker ones. Antoine made notes in his leather journal, sketching the damage patterns with the same precision he'd used for creating a new piece. His brother Francois had once said that Antoine approached his craft like a detective solving crimes. "Every hair tells a story," Francois would tease. If only he knew how literal that observation would prove. The work was meditative, requiring just enough concentration to occupy his hands while leaving his mind free to wander. Through the window, he could see the grounds stretching toward the forest, where morning mist still clung to the trees. Occasionally, servants passed through the courtyard below, their voices carrying up in fragments of conversation about daily concerns. The wine delivery was late. The new kitchen maid had burned the bread. Madame's nerves were acting up again.
Marie-Claire appeared in his doorway around noon, carrying a tray. "Mademoiselle Dufour thought you might appreciate some refreshment, monsieur." The maid set down the tray with practiced efficiency, but Antoine noticed how her eyes kept drifting to the wigs. "Have you been in service here long, Marie-Claire?"
8 years, monsieur."
She straightened a cup that didn't need straightening.
"Since I was 18.
"You must know the house well, then, all its stories." She stiffened slightly.
"I mind my duties, monsieur, that's all."
But as she turned to leave, she paused at the door.
"If you're working late, monsieur, best to lock the door. Things in this house, they don't always stay where you leave them."
Before Antoine could ask what she meant, she was gone. He made another note in his journal, then returned to his work. The second wig revealed the same pattern of damage, and the third. Someone had been harvesting hair from these pieces. But why?
Human hair was valuable, certainly, but not so much as to risk damaging museum pieces. That evening, Antoine decided to examine the portrait more closely. The gallery was empty, lit only by the dying daylight and a few oil lamps that created more shadows than illumination. The portrait of Madame Celeste seemed different in this light, more alive somehow, as if she might step from the frame at any moment. Antoine stood where he had that morning, then slowly moved from side to side. The hair definitely changed color. Not dramatically, but subtly, the way real hair caught light. He stepped closer, close enough to see the individual brushstrokes. The technique was extraordinary. The artist had built up the hair in layers, creating actual texture. But there was something else, something that made his craftsman's instincts alert. "Magnificent, isn't she?" Antoine nearly jumped. Count de Montmorency stood in the doorway, a glass of cognac in his hand. "The technique is remarkable, Your Excellency." "Jean-Baptiste Mercier," the Count said, approaching the portrait, "a student of David. But he developed his own methods. Some said he was a genius. Others called him a madman. Perhaps there's little difference." The Count sipped his cognac thoughtfully. "He was in love with her, you know, Madame Celeste. Hopelessly, pathetically in love. She was married to my great-great-uncle, of course, but that didn't stop Mercier from worshipping her. This portrait took him 3 years to complete." 3 years? Antoine was genuinely surprised.
Even for a work of this quality, that was excessive. He was obsessive about the hair, particularly. Insisted on painting only when the light was perfect, only when she was present. Some days he would add just a few strokes. The household thought him quite mad by the end. What happened to him? He disappeared shortly after finishing the portrait. Some say he went to Italy.
Others that he drowned himself in the Seine. Madame Celeste died just 2 years later. Fever, they said, though she was only 36. The Count's voice carried old sadness. Beautiful women rarely live long in our family. It's almost as if beauty itself is a disease that consumes them. They stood in silence for a moment, both looking at the portrait. Then Antoine noticed something that made him lean closer. At certain angles, in certain light, there seemed to be actual depth to the hair, as if it extended somehow beyond the canvas surface. "Your Excellency," Antoine began carefully, "has anyone ever conducted a technical examination of the painting?" The Count's expression tightened. "Once, in 1850, as Laroche mentioned, the man claimed, well, he claimed many things. That Mercier had mixed actual hair into the paint, that he'd used some kind of organic compounds that continued to react to the environment. Absurd, of course. But Antoine heard the doubt in his voice. The Count believed more than he was willing to admit. That night, Antoine worked late, restoration procedures becoming automatic while his mind puzzled over what he'd observed. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the corridor. They paused outside his door, and he heard the handle turn slowly. But he'd taken Marie Claire's advice and locked it. The footsteps retreated. The next morning, September 18th, brought an unexpected development. One of the wigs he'd carefully cleaned and arranged the night before was disheveled, hairs pulled from exactly the same spots as the original damage. Antoine knew he'd locked the door. The key was still in his pocket. The windows were too high to reach from outside. He examined the wig carefully under his magnifying glass. Fresh tool marks on the foundation showed someone had used tweezers or fine pliers. But why? He collected the few loose hairs that remained and wrapped them in paper. Perhaps they would tell him something later. The day passed in careful work, but Antoine found himself increasingly distracted. He began timing his observations, visiting the portrait at different hours. At 9 in the morning, the hair appeared lighter, almost golden in the eastern light. By noon, it had deepened to rich auburn. At 4, as the sun moved west, it seemed to hold shadows that gave it incredible depth. Mademoiselle Dufour found him there during one of these observations. "You're becoming quite fascinated with our mysterious lady," she observed. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," Antoine replied carefully. "Indeed." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Monsieur Roussel, may I speak frankly?" Antoine nodded. "Monsieur Laroche has been troubled lately. Financial difficulties, I believe. I've noticed him spending unusual amounts of time in the gallery, particularly near this portrait. I thought you should know." "Why tell me this, mademoiselle?" She considered her words carefully. "Because you strike me as a man who notices things, and because this house has enough secrets without adding theft to them." That evening, Antoine received a letter from Paris. Pierre wrote in his childish hand that Monsieur Fournier had indeed come to the shop, but that Madame Delacroix had been there for a fitting and had somehow charmed him into discussing the merits of different hair types for 2 hours, by which time his anger had cooled to mere disapproval.
The boy also mentioned that he'd completed the first theatrical wig and enclosed a sketch to prove it. Despite everything, Antoine smiled. Perhaps the boy had potential after all. But his smile faded as he returned to his journal, comparing his notes about the damage patterns. Someone in this house was stealing hair from the antique wigs, and he was beginning to suspect it had something to do with the portrait of Madame Celeste. The only question was whether he was dealing with a thief, a madman, or something else entirely.
The chateau's library occupied the entire west tower. 3 stories of books reaching toward a painted ceiling where allegorical figures of the arts and sciences gazed down with serene indifference. On the morning of September 21st, Antoine stood before shelves that hadn't been properly dusted in years, searching for any information about Jean-Baptiste Mercier. The Count had given him permission to research the artist, perhaps hoping that understanding the portrait's creation might explain its peculiarities. Antoine pulled volume after volume, finding references to Mercier's contemporaries, David, Gros, Ingres, but the man himself seemed to have been deliberately erased from art history. Finally, in a collection of bound journals from the estate itself, Antoine struck gold. The volumes from 1809 through 1812 contained numerous references to that peculiar painter and his work on Madame Celeste's portrait. The entries, written by the Count's great-great-uncle, revealed a household both fascinated and disturbed by Mercier's presence.
October 3rd, 1809, Antoine read aloud in the dusty silence. Mercier has requested samples of Celeste's hair, claiming he needs to match the color precisely. She was amused and agreed. He spent 3 hours simply arranging the strands in different lights, muttering about capturing the living essence. The servants think him touched. Another entry from the following spring. The painter has taken to visiting my chemistry laboratory. He questions me endlessly about compounds and reactions, about what makes organic matter respond to its environment. Yesterday he asked if I believed hair could retain life after being cut. I told him he should concern himself with paint and canvas, not natural philosophy. Antoine made careful notes, his excitement growing.
Here was evidence that Mercier had indeed been experimenting with unusual techniques. But it was an entry from August 1811 that made him stop breathing for a moment.
Mercier has gone too far. I found him in the laboratory at dawn, grinding Celeste's hair into powder and mixing it with his pigments. He claims this will make the portrait eternally alive, that her beauty will never fade because part of her physical being will be embedded in the work itself. I threatened to dismiss him, but Celeste intervened. She is charmed by his devotion, flattered by his obsession. I fear no good will come of this. Fascinating reading? Antoine turned to find a man standing in the doorway, 48 years old, with the precise bearing of someone accustomed to academic authority. His accent was distinctly German. Dr. Emil Bergman, the man introduced himself, approaching with extended hand. I'm here studying Mercier's work for the Berlin Academy. The Count mentioned you were researching the same subject. They shook hands, and Antoine noticed the telltale stains of chemical work on the doctor's fingers, a fellow craftsman of sorts, though of a different craft. You've found the house journals, I see, Bergman continued. Have you reached the entries about his experiments yet? Just beginning to, Antoine admitted. You seem to know more about Mercier than anyone else I've encountered. Bergman smiled thinly. 5 years of research across Europe, tracking down his works. There are only 7 confirmed Mercier paintings in existence, and all of them display unusual properties. The portrait here is the most remarkable. Unusual how? Come, I'll show you. Bergman led Antoine back to the portrait gallery, but instead of stopping at Madame Celeste's portrait, he directed Antoine's attention to a smaller painting in the corner, a still life of flowers that Antoine hadn't noticed before.
Also by Mercier, Bergman explained, producing a magnifying glass. Look closely at the red roses. Antoine examined the painting through the lens. The roses seemed to shimmer, their color shifting subtly even as he watched. The pigment seems almost crystalline. Exactly. Mercier ground insects, specifically cochineal, into his red pigments, but not in the usual way. He kept them partially alive during the grinding process, preserving certain proteins that continue to react to moisture in the air. The painting literally breathes with the atmosphere. They returned to Madame Celeste's portrait. Bergman's excitement was palpable as he pointed out details Antoine had missed. See how the hair seems to have actual dimension? That's because he built it up in dozens of microscopically thin layers, each containing different organic compounds. Horn dissolved in acid, silk fibers, and yes, actual human hair ground to powder and suspended in his medium. But why? Antoine asked. Why go to such extremes? Love, Bergman said simply, or obsession, if you prefer. Mercier believed he could capture not just the appearance of life, but life itself. He was trying to make her immortal. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of urgent footsteps. Pierre burst into the gallery, his face flushed from travel and distress. "Master, I'm sorry. I know you said to stay in Paris, but—" Antoine held up a hand, acutely aware of Bergman's interested gaze. "Gentlemen, may I introduce my apprentice, Pierre. Pierre, this is Dr. Bergman." The boy barely managed a bow before continuing. "It's Monsieur Fournier, master. He's coming here. He found out where you went and he's following with the police. He says I've compromised his daughter's honor and—" "Breathe, boy." Antoine placed a steadying hand on Pierre's shoulder, though internally he was calculating rapidly. A Parisian merchant arriving at the chateau with wild accusations would be a disaster for his reputation. Young love, Bergman observed with amusement. The eternal comedy. When did he leave Paris? Antoine asked. This morning, master. I came as fast as I could to warn you. Antoine made a quick decision. You'll stay here and assist me. Make yourself useful and stay out of sight. We'll deal with Monsieur Fournier if he actually arrives. He turned to Bergman. My apologies for the disruption. Not at all, the doctor replied. In fact, if you're interested, I was planning to conduct some tests on paint samples from the portrait this afternoon. Strictly non-invasive, of course. Perhaps your apprentice could assist us both? The afternoon's work proved revelatory. In a small laboratory Bergman had set up in an unused pantry, they examined tiny flakes of paint that had naturally fallen from the portrait's frame over the years. Under Bergman's microscope, the structure was unlike anything Antoine had seen. Organic and crystalline simultaneously, with fibers that seemed to maintain their flexibility after 60 years. Remarkable, Bergman muttered, adjusting the lens. The binding medium appears to be a combination of traditional oils and something else. Perhaps egg tempera mixed with an organic fixative. See these dark strands? That's actual hair integrated into the paint matrix itself. Pierre, despite his romantic troubles, proved surprisingly helpful, preparing slides with steady hands and taking detailed notes. The boy had always been good with delicate work when he could focus. As evening approached, Antoine left Bergman and Pierre still working and returned to his restoration.
But when he entered his workroom, he found chaos. 3 of the wigs he'd been restoring were pulled from their stands, hair scattered across the floor.
His tools were disturbed, and his journal. His journal was open to the page where he'd sketched the damage patterns. Antoine heard footsteps retreating rapidly down the corridor. He gave chase, following the sound down a servant's staircase and through a door that led to the gardens. In the fading light, he glimpsed a figure disappearing into the hedge maze, too far to identify, but clearly someone who knew the grounds well. Returning to his workshop, Antoine found Laroche standing in the doorway, breathing heavily as if he'd been running.
"Monsieur Roussel, I heard a disturbance. Is everything well?"
Antoine studied the curator's face carefully. The man's collar was askew, and there were leaf fragments on his shoulder.
"Someone has disturbed my work, Monsieur Laroche. They seemed particularly interested in the hair I've been collecting."
Laroche's eye twitched slightly.
"How unfortunate. We've had problems with theft before. The servants, you understand."
Some of them believe old hair has properties. Superstition, but persistent.
"Indeed," Antoine replied neutrally. "I'll need to report this to the Count."
"Of course," Laroche agreed quickly. "Though perhaps it would be better to wait until we know more. No need to worry His Excellency unnecessarily." After Laroche left, Antoine carefully collected the scattered hair, noting that only the auburn strands had been taken, the same color as Madame Celeste's painted locks. He was beginning to see a pattern, though its meaning remained frustratingly obscure. Dr. Bergman's makeshift laboratory had expanded by September 26th to occupy most of the unused pantry and part of the adjacent storage room. Glass vessels bubbled over spirit lamps, and the air carried the sharp smell of chemicals that made Pierre sneeze every few minutes. Antoine watched as the German doctor carefully applied a solution to a microscopic sample of paint from the portrait's frame.
"Look here," Bergman said, his eye pressed to the microscope. "When I add moisture, just water vapor from my breath, watch what happens." Antoine took his turn at the lens. The paint fragment seemed to swell slightly, and the embedded hair fibers actually moved, uncurling like tiny springs. "That's impossible. After 60 years, any organic material should be completely desiccated." "Should be, yes. But Mercier found a way to preserve the reactive properties." Bergman moved to his notes, pages covered in chemical formulas. "I've identified several compounds, tree resins that remain flexible, proteins that maintain their structure, and something else I can't quite identify. It seems to be derived from insects, but modified somehow." Pierre, who had been grinding samples in a mortar, suddenly spoke up. "Master, this powder, it's moving." Both men hurried over. The apprentice had been working with hair samples from the damaged wigs, grinding them for comparison with the painted hair. In the mortar, the ground hair seemed to shift and swirl, though there was no draft in the room. "Static electricity," Antoine said, though he didn't quite believe it himself. "Perhaps," Bergman said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps Mercier's techniques affected not just the portrait, but everything connected to it. These wigs belonged to Madame Celeste, yes? She would have worn them while sitting for the portrait." The idea seemed fantastical, yet Antoine couldn't dismiss the evidence before his eyes. He thought of the disturbed wigs in his workshop, the missing auburn strands, Laroche's suspicious behavior. "Doctor, what would happen if someone were trying to harvest these materials, to use them for something?" Bergman's expression darkened. "That would be most unwise. These compounds are stable in their current form, but if someone were trying to extract or reconstitute them..." He trailed off, then moved to his chemical supplies. "We should test this theory." The experiment was simple but revealing. Bergman took a few strands of the hair Antoine had preserved from the wigs and subjected them to various solutions. Most produced no reaction, but when he applied a mixture of alcohol and certain plant extracts, the hair began to change color, shifting from auburn to gold to deep brown and back again.
"Remarkable," Antoine breathed. "It's as if the hair remembers different states of being."
"Master," Pierre interrupted, his voice tight with worry. "Someone's coming." They heard footsteps in the corridor, multiple people moving with purpose. Antoine quickly covered the experimental materials as the door opened to reveal Laroche, Count de Montmorency, and Mademoiselle Dufour. "Gentlemen," the Count said, his tone formal, "I understand there have been some irregularities." Laroche stepped forward, his manner accusatory. "I found evidence that someone has been removing material from the portrait itself."
Small amounts, but still, this is vandalism of a priceless artwork.
Antoine kept his expression neutral. "What evidence, Monsieur Laroche?" The curator produced a small envelope. Inside were several dozen hair-thin fibers and what appeared to be tiny paint flakes. "I found these in the servants' quarters, hidden behind a loose board." "Whose quarters?" Mademoiselle Dufour asked sharply.
Marie Claire's, Laroche replied with obvious satisfaction.
"I suspected she was involved in something. She's always been too interested in that portrait." The Count's face was grim. "Bring her here." Marie Claire arrived within minutes, her face pale but composed. She looked at the evidence without surprise, then raised her chin defiantly. "I haven't taken anything from the portrait, Your Excellency." "Then explain these," Laroche demanded. The maid turned to look directly at him. "Perhaps you should explain them, monsieur. After all, you're the one who asked me to help you 3 months ago."
You said you needed samples for authentication, that scholars in Paris would pay well for them. The room went very still. Laroche's face flushed deep red.
"The girl is lying. She's trying to deflect blame." "I kept your letters," Marie Claire continued quietly. "The ones where you explained your debts, how desperate you were. You said no one would notice a few missing strands." Mademoiselle Dufour moved smoothly to stand beside Marie Claire. "I think, Your Excellency, we should examine this matter more carefully. I've noticed discrepancies in the household accounts that Monsieur Laroche manages." The Count looked between his curator and his housemaid, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Antoine. "Monsieur Roussel, as an outside observer, what is your professional opinion?" Antoine chose his words carefully. "The damage to the wigs follows a specific pattern. Someone has been taking hair of a particular color and texture, the same type that appears in the portrait."
As for why, he glanced at Bergman, who nodded slightly.
"We've discovered that the materials Mercier used have unusual properties. They respond to environmental changes in ways that normal paint and hair should not." "What kind of properties?" the Count asked. Bergman stepped forward. "Your Excellency, Mercier embedded actual organic material from Madame Celeste into the portrait, her hair, possibly other substances. These materials have been preserved in a reactive state. They continue to respond to humidity, temperature, even the chemical composition of the air around them." "You're saying the portrait is actually alive?" Laroche scoffed, though his voice trembled slightly. "Not alive," Antoine corrected, "but not entirely dead either. It exists in a state between
Preserved yet reactive, static yet dynamic. The Count was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with old knowledge. My family has known this for generations.
We've maintained the fiction of mystery while secretly preserving the portrait through careful environmental control. But recently, someone has been disturbing that balance. He turned to Laroche. You've been stealing from the portrait to sell to collectors, haven't you? Using Marie Claire as your unwitting accomplice by asking her to clean areas you'd already damaged. Laroche's shoulders sagged in defeat. The debts. My creditors were threatening exposure. I thought just a few samples wouldn't matter. But then I realized the hair was actually growing back, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but growing. I took more, thinking no one would notice if it regenerated. Growing, Pierre burst out, then immediately looked apologetic for speaking. Not growing, Bergman corrected. Expanding and contracting with moisture changes, creating an illusion of growth. But repeated harvesting would eventually deplete the embedded materials. Marie Claire finally spoke again, her voice steady. I tried to repair the damage, Your Excellency. My grandmother was a seamstress. She taught me about conservation. I've been applying a solution of egg white and wine to stabilize the areas Monsieur Laroche damaged. I didn't know what else to do. Antoine felt a grudging admiration for the maid's ingenuity. Her primitive conservation efforts had probably saved the portrait from worse damage. The Count made his decision. Laroche, you'll leave tonight. I'll provide enough to clear your debts, consider it severance for your years of service, but you're never to return or speak of this matter. He turned to Marie Claire. You should have come to me immediately. I was afraid, Your Excellency. Who would believe a maid over a curator? The Count's expression softened slightly. You've proven your loyalty, even if your methods were unconventional.
Mademoiselle Dufour, see that Marie Claire is given new responsibilities, ones that suit her obvious intelligence. As the group dispersed, Antoine found himself alone with Bergman and Pierre. The apprentice looked overwhelmed by everything he'd witnessed. Master, Pierre said slowly, if the portrait contains actual parts of Madame Celeste, and those parts still react to the world, what does that mean? Antoine considered the question. What indeed did it mean when art and science converged to create something that transcended both? When human vanity and artistic obsession produced a work that existed outside normal categories of living and dead? October 1st arrived with unseasonable warmth that made the chateau feel drowsy and thick with secrets. Antoine had developed a routine of sorts, restoration work during the day, research in the evening, and increasingly, observation of the portrait at odd hours.
Something Laroche had said before his departure kept nagging at him. The hair was growing back. Not possible, Bergman had insisted, yet Antoine wasn't entirely convinced. That night, he positioned himself in an alcove of the portrait gallery where shadows would conceal him. He'd told no one of his plan, not even Pierre, who was sleeping soundly in the servants' quarters after spending the day helping pack Bergman's equipment for his departure later that week. The gallery at night was a different world. Moonlight through tall windows created silver pathways across the floor, and the portraits seemed to watch with more attention than they showed during daylight hours. Antoine had brought a small notebook and pencil, intending to document any changes he observed, though he felt slightly foolish, a grown man playing at ghost hunting. By midnight, his legs were cramping and his eyes were heavy. He was about to abandon his vigil when he heard soft footsteps. Someone was approaching with the careful gait of one who knew exactly which floorboards creaked. A figure entered the gallery, carrying a single candle. To Antoine's surprise, it was Marie Claire, but transformed from the timid maid he'd first encountered. She moved with purpose toward Madame Celeste's portrait, set down her candle on a small table, and withdrew several items from her apron: a fine brush, a small vial, and what appeared to be a jeweler's loupe. Antoine watched, fascinated, as she examined the portrait with professional skill, paying particular attention to the areas where Laroche had harvested hair. Then she did something unexpected. She began to apply tiny amounts of the solution from her vial, not to the damaged areas, but to specific points around them, as if following a map only she could see. "You can come out, Monsieur Roussel," she said quietly, without turning around. "I've known you were there for the past hour." Antoine emerged, slightly embarrassed. "How did you know?" "You breathe like someone who works with chemicals, careful and measured. Plus, you smoke a pipe with Turkish tobacco. The scent is quite distinctive." She continued her work as she spoke. "I suppose you want to know what I'm really doing?" The thought had crossed my mind. Marie Claire smiled slightly, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "My grandmother wasn't just a seamstress. She was a restorer for the Louvre before the Revolution. She taught me that preservation is an art of patience and observation." She gestured to the portrait. "I've been maintaining this for 3 years, ever since I noticed the first changes." "What kind of changes?" "Watch." She held her candle close to a section of painted hair, careful not to let the flame touch. The warmth caused an immediate reaction. The hair seemed to lift slightly, individual strands separating and realigning. When she moved the heat away, they settled back, but not quite in their original position. "Every night, depending on the temperature and humidity, it shifts," Marie Claire explained. "If left alone, it tends toward chaos, tangling, matting. So I guide it back into proper arrangement." Antoine moved closer, his professional interest overcoming caution. "But that's impossible. Paint doesn't behave that way." "Mercier's paint does." She showed him her vial. "This is a formula my grandmother developed. Egg white, wine, and something she never named but taught me to make from beetles and tree sap. It doesn't restore the hair, but it encourages it to remember its proper form." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Marie Claire demonstrating her technique while Antoine took notes. She had developed an entire system, specific brush strokes for different sections, varying solutions for different colors, even a schedule based on lunar phases and seasonal changes. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Antoine asked. "Tell them what? That I spend my nights grooming a painting?" "They'd think me mad. Besides, the Count knows, in his way. Why do you think I've never been assigned night duties? Why my position has been so secure despite my youth when I arrived?" Antoine considered this. The Count had indeed seemed unsurprised by recent revelations, as if he'd been waiting for someone else to discover what he already knew. "There's more," Marie Claire said, her voice dropping. "Laroche wasn't the first to try harvesting from the portrait. My predecessor, an old woman named Marguerite, told me that every generation someone discovers the secret and tries to profit from it. But the portrait always survives, and the thieves, they don't fare well." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then pointed to a smaller portrait on the opposite wall, a man in 1830s dress. "That was the curator before Laroche's predecessor. He stole hair from the portrait to sell to a collector in England. Within a year, he'd lost everything,
his position, his wealth, his mind.
He died claiming that Madame Celeste visited him at night, demanding her hair back. Antoine felt a chill despite the warm night. Coincidence, surely. Perhaps. Or perhaps there's a price for disturbing what Mercier created. She finished her work and began packing her tools. I should tell you something else. The portrait isn't unique. There are others, not paintings, but objects Mercier created using similar techniques. The Count has been quietly collecting them for years. This was news to Antoine. What kind of objects? A mirror that shows people at different ages depending on the viewing angle, a piece of jewelry that changes color with the wearer's mood. They're kept in a locked room in the east wing. She paused at the gallery door. If you're truly interested in understanding Mercier's work, you should ask the Count to show you. But be warned, once you've seen them, you can't unsee what they imply about the nature of preservation and memory. After Marie-Claire left, Antoine remained in the gallery, staring at Madame Celeste's portrait. The painted eyes seemed to follow him as he moved, a trick of the artist's skill he'd noticed in many portraits. But now he wondered if it was merely a trick. He approached closer than he'd dared before, close enough to see the individual brushstrokes, the way the paint had been built up in translucent layers. And there, so faint he might have imagined it, was the scent of roses, the same perfume that would have been popular in 1810. A sound made him turn. Pierre stood in the doorway, disheveled from sleep and clearly distressed.
Master, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a man at the gates, Monsieur Fournier. He's actually come. He's demanding to see you immediately, says he won't leave until... Master, what should I do?
Antoine sighed. The real world, with its mundane troubles and pedestrian conflicts, seemed almost comforting after the evening's revelations. Wake Mademoiselle Dufour. Tell her we have an unexpected guest who requires diplomatic handling. And Pierre? Yes, master? Perhaps it's time you learned that running from problems only makes them chase you faster. The boy nodded miserably. As they left the gallery, Antoine took one last look at the portrait. In the shifting moonlight, Madame Celeste's expression seemed almost amused, as if she found the concerns of the living entertainingly trivial. Walking through the darkened chateau, Antoine reflected on what Marie-Claire had revealed. The portrait wasn't just an artwork or even a scientific curiosity. It was a responsibility, passed down through generations of secret keepers. And now, whether he'd intended it or not, he'd become part of that tradition. The sound of angry voices from the entrance hall drew him back to immediate concerns. Monsieur Fournier had arrived, and from the volume of his protestations, he'd fortified himself with considerable liquid courage during his journey. Antoine straightened his coat and prepared to face a different kind of mystery, the eternal puzzle of young love and parental outrage. The morning of October 6th found Antoine in the chateau's oldest wing, surrounded by documents that hadn't seen daylight in decades. After successfully mediating between Pierre and Monsieur Fournier, a negotiation that had required all of Mademoiselle Dufour's diplomatic skills and a considerable amount of the Count's excellent brandy, Antoine had returned to his true puzzle with renewed focus. The resolution with Fournier had been surprisingly civilized once the man sobered. Pierre would complete his apprenticeship and then, with proper credentials, could court the daughter formally. The boy had learned his lesson about the dangers of romantic impetuosity, though Antoine suspected the lesson would need repeating, as such lessons always did with the young. Now,
in the dusty quiet of the archive room, Antoine discovered what he'd been searching for, a leather-bound volume marked simply Restoration Notes, 1789 through 1870. The handwriting changed every few decades, but the subject remained constant: maintenance of the Mercier portrait. The first entry, dated just before the Revolution, was barely legible. The portrait requires attention twice monthly. Hair must be arranged using the prescribed solution. Areas of lifting must be stabilized. Under no circumstances should anyone attempt to remove embedded materials. But it was an entry from 1832 that made Antoine's pulse quicken. I have discovered the truth that my predecessors only guessed at. Mercier created not one portrait, but two: the visible painting and an invisible substrate beneath, connected by the embedded organic materials. The surface painting acts as a membrane, responding to environmental changes, while the substrate maintains the essential pattern. This is why damage to the surface seems to heal. It is being reformed from below. Antoine cross-referenced this with his own observations. It explained so much: the apparent regrowth, the color changes, the sense of depth that seemed impossible in a painting. Mercier hadn't just painted Madame Celeste. He'd created a dynamic system that preserved her appearance in a state of constant, subtle renewal. "Finding anything interesting?" The Count stood in the doorway, looking frailer than Antoine remembered from even a week ago. "Your Excellency, these records, generations of your family have known about the portrait's nature." "Known and protected it," the Count confirmed, entering the room with careful steps. "Each generation produces a keeper, sometimes a family member, sometimes a trusted servant like Marie Claire. The burden passes on, as burdens do." He settled into a chair with obvious relief. Dr. Bergman left this morning, you know, but not before sharing his findings with me. He believes Mercier discovered something that modern science is only beginning to understand: how to preserve biological information in a stable but responsive matrix. "And you've collected other examples of his work?" The Count smiled tiredly. "Would you like to see them? I think perhaps it's time. My health, well, decisions must be made about the future of these objects." They walked slowly through the chateau, the Count leaning increasingly on his walking stick. The locked room Marie Claire had mentioned was behind an unmarked door in the east wing. Inside, Antoine found himself in a cabinet of wonders, a dozen objects displayed with museum-quality care. The mirror Marie Claire had described stood against one wall, its silver surface seemingly normal until Antoine moved. Then he saw himself at different ages, younger from the left, older from the right, his current age only visible from directly in front. The effect was disorienting, as if time itself had been caught in the glass. "Mercier made this for Madame Celeste in 1811, the Count explained. "She could see herself at 20, at 30, at 40, all the ages she would never reach." There was jewelry, a necklace that shifted from silver to gold depending on how it was held, rings that seemed to pulse with inner light. Each piece incorporated organic materials in ways that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of the time. "How did he do it?" Antoine asked, examining a hairbrush whose bristles remained soft and flexible after 60 years. "We may never fully know." His journals speak of capturing the essence of change itself, of finding the boundary between living and dead matter. He was obsessed with permanence that wasn't static, preservation that continued to breathe.
The Count moved to a small cabinet and withdrew a box. "This is why I really brought you here, Monsieur Roussel. Inside is Mercier's final work, a wig he made from Madame Celeste's hair just before her death. It's never been worn, never been displayed. I want you to have it." Antoine opened the box carefully. The wig inside was extraordinary, not just in its craftsmanship, but in its presence. The hair seemed to glow with inner light, arranged in a style that was both of its time and timeless. When he touched it, the hair felt warm, alive. "I can't accept this, Your Excellency. It's priceless." "Exactly why I'm giving it to you. It needs someone who understands both the craft and the mystery. My heir, a nephew in Lyon, cares nothing for these things.
He'll sell the chateau as soon as I'm gone. But this deserves better." Antoine recognized the weight of what was being offered. Not just an object, but a responsibility. "What about the portrait?" "It will remain with the house, part of the sale conditions. Marie-Claire has agreed to stay on regardless of who owns the property. She understands her duty." The Count paused, considering. "But the wig, that should go with someone who can appreciate what it represents. The triumph of art over time, of love over loss." They returned to Antoine's workshop, where Pierre was diligently working on the theatrical wigs, determined to prove his newfound maturity. The boy looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the box Antoine carried. "Continue your work, Pierre," Antoine said gently. "Excellence requires focus." The Count departed, leaving Antoine alone with his thoughts and the remarkable wig. He studied it in the afternoon light, noting techniques he'd never seen before. Knots that seemed to have no beginning or end. Hair that changed color as naturally as a living head would in different lights. Marie-Claire appeared in the doorway as evening approached. "He's given it to you then?" "You knew?" "The Count discussed it with me. He wanted my opinion on whether you could be trusted with such a thing." She moved closer, examining the wig with professional interest. "My grandmother saw it once. She said it was Mercier's masterpiece, not the portrait, but this. The portrait was for the world. This was for him." "What do you mean?" "He made it after Madame Celeste died, but before he disappeared. Some say he planned to place it on her body for the funeral, to restore her beauty in death. Others think he kept it as a reminder of what he'd lost. Either way, it's never been worn by anyone." Antoine carefully returned the wig to its box. He thought of his brother Francois, broken and bitter in his bed, of Pierre struggling with young love, of his own loneliness since his wife's death. Everyone carried losses, tried to preserve what couldn't be preserved. "What will you do with it?" Marie-Claire asked. "Learn from it," Antoine replied. "Study its techniques, understand its construction, and then—" He paused, uncertain himself. "Then perhaps create something new. Not a copy, but something inspired by Mercier's vision. Art that lives without being alive." Marie-Claire smiled. "That sounds like a worthy goal, monsieur. My grandmother would have approved." As she left, Antoine noticed she'd placed a small vial on his workbench, some of her preservation solution. A gift, or perhaps an invitation to join the long line of keepers who'd maintained Mercier's legacy. He picked up the vial, feeling its weight, understanding that some mysteries were meant not to be solved, but to be tended.
like gardens that bloomed in darkness.
Father Mathieu arrived at the chateau on the morning of October 11th, his 70 years evident in his slow gait, but not in his sharp eyes. The Count had summoned him, though not for last rites. Not yet, the Count had said with grim humor. Instead, he'd come to share what he called the complete story of Madame Celeste and Jean-Baptiste Mercier. They gathered in the library, Antoine, the Count, Father Mathieu, and, surprisingly, Mademoiselle Dufour, who the Count insisted had earned the right to know the full truth. Pierre was sent to the village on an errand, his youth deemed too green for such revelations. The priest settled into a leather chair with obvious relief, accepting the glass of wine Mademoiselle Dufour offered. "I was chaplain here in my youth," he began, his voice still strong despite his age. "The previous Count, your father, Your Excellency, told me this story on his deathbed." He'd had it from his father, who knew Madame Celeste personally. He sipped his wine, gathering his thoughts. Celeste de Montmorency was born Celeste Girard, daughter of a successful merchant. Beautiful, yes, but also brilliant. She spoke 4 languages, understood mathematics, could discourse on philosophy. The marriage to the Count's ancestor was arranged, but by all accounts they were fond of each other. "And Mercier?" Antoine prompted. "Ah, Mercier." The priest's expression grew complex. Jean-Baptiste Mercier was the son of a Swiss watchmaker who'd moved to Paris. He inherited his father's obsession with precision, but applied it to art instead of mechanics. He met Celeste at a salon in Paris in 1808. She was 28, married 5 years, childless. He was 32, unmarried, already gaining reputation for his unusual techniques. Father Mathieu paused, seeming to weigh his words. What happened between them was not the common adultery you might expect. It was something more rare and perhaps more dangerous. A complete meeting of minds. Celeste found in Mercier someone who saw her not just as a beautiful ornament, but as an intellect equal to his own. They began corresponding, discussing art, science, philosophy. "The letters still exist," the Count interjected, "locked in the family vault. They're remarkable, discussions of optics, the nature of perception, theories about preservation of organic matter that wouldn't be formally proposed by scientists for decades." "The Portrait Commission came in 1809, Father Mathieu continued. "The Count, the current Count's great-great-uncle, thought it would be a pleasant surprise for his wife. He didn't know about the correspondence, didn't understand what he was setting in motion." Mademoiselle Dufour refilled the priest's glass. "What was set in motion, Father?" "An obsession that consumed them both." Mercier wasn't content to simply paint Celeste. He wanted to capture her essence, to preserve not just her appearance, but something of her living presence. And Celeste, vain creature that she was, wanted to be preserved. She was watching herself age, seeing the first lines, the first gray hairs. The thought of her beauty fading terrified her. The priest stood, moving to the window with surprising vigor. They began experimenting together. Celeste provided not just hair, but blood, saliva, even tears. Mercier mixed these into his pigments using techniques he'd learned from ancient texts, Egyptian methods of preservation, Chinese lacquer work, alchemical processes that bordered on madness. Antoine felt a chill. They were trying to achieve immortality through art?
In a way. Mercier believed that if enough of a person's biological essence was integrated into a properly prepared medium, something of their living spirit would persist.
Celeste was willing to try anything to preserve her beauty. Father Mathieu turned back to face them. But there was a price, as there always is when humans try to cheat death.
What price? Mademoiselle Dufour asked quietly.
Celeste began to fade as the portrait grew more vibrant.
It was subtle at first. She tired more easily, her famous wit dulled. But by 1811, when the portrait was nearly complete, she was seriously ill. The doctors couldn't explain it. She seemed to be aging rapidly, as if years were passing in months. The Count spoke up, his voice heavy. My family always claimed she died of fever, but that was a comfortable lie. She died of depletion. Mercier had literally painted the life out of her. That's not possible, Antoine protested, though even as he said it, he thought of the portrait's uncanny presence, the way it seemed more alive than painted. Perhaps not by the science we understand, Father Mathieu agreed.
But Mercier was working with principles we're only beginning to rediscover. Dr. Bergman said as much before he left, that Mercier had found ways to preserve biological information that shouldn't have been possible. The priest returned to his chair. Celeste died on December 3rd, 1812. Mercier finished the portrait the day before. When he saw her body, something broke in him. He created that wig, he nodded to Antoine, from her hair, collected over the years of painting. Then he disappeared. Some say suicide, but I believe he went searching for a way to reverse what he'd done. And found it? Mademoiselle Dufour suggested. Who can say? But consider this. The portrait doesn't just preserve Celeste's appearance. According to family legend, it preserves something of her nature. Visitors have reported feeling her presence, sensing her vanity, her intelligence, her fear of aging. The portrait isn't just an image, it's a repository. They sat in silence, digesting this information. Finally, Antoine spoke. If this is true, then the portrait is an abomination, Father Mathieu said firmly. And yet, also a miracle. It represents the ultimate human ambition, to preserve ourselves against time, and the ultimate human folly, believing we can improve on God's design. He struggled to his feet. I've told you what I know. What you do with this knowledge is your choice. After the priest departed, the Count turned to Antoine. Now you understand why the portrait must be preserved, but also why it must never be copied. Mercier's techniques died with him, and perhaps that's for the best. That afternoon, Antoine found himself once again in his workshop, the wig Mercier had made sitting before him. Understanding its history made it both more precious and more terrible. This was made from the hair of a woman who'd sacrificed her life essence for eternal beauty, and perhaps achieved it, in a way. Pierre returned from the village with news that Monsieur Fournier had written, formally accepting the proposal for courtship once Pierre completed his apprenticeship. The boy was elated, but Antoine found it hard to share his joy. He was thinking of Celeste and Mercier, of the price of preservation. Master, is something wrong? Pierre asked, noticing his distraction. Tell me, Pierre, if you could preserve something of yourself forever, your youth, your love for Mademoiselle Fournier, would you do it? Pierre considered seriously. But then it wouldn't be real, would it? Love changes,
grows. If it's preserved, it's dead.
From the mouths of babes, Antoine thought. Perhaps that was Mercier's true tragedy, not that he failed to preserve Celeste, but that he succeeded too well, trapping her in an eternal moment that could never grow or change.
That evening he made a decision. He would study the wig, learn its techniques, but he would never attempt to replicate them fully. Some knowledge was meant to be understood, but not used, held in trust for future generations who might be wiser about the price of transcending mortality. The October 16th morning brought unseasonable cold, and Antoine woke to find frost patterns on his workshop windows that reminded him uncannily of the crystalline structures he'd observed in Mercier's paint. The chateau seemed to huddle into itself, and even the portrait of Madame Celeste appeared subdued in the gray light filtering through the gallery windows. 5 days had passed since Father Mathieu's revelations, and in that time Antoine had barely left his workshop except to sleep. The restoration of the original wigs was complete, each piece stabilized, cleaned, and properly stored. But his real work had been studying Mercier's masterpiece, the unworn wig that seemed to pulse with its own inner life. Pierre had proven surprisingly helpful, his romantic troubles having matured him in unexpected ways. The boy now worked with focused dedication, as if understanding that mastery of one's craft was the foundation upon which all other ambitions must be built. He was currently preparing a special preservation case for the Mercier wig, following Antoine's exacting specifications.
"Master," Pierre said, looking up from his work, "the Count has asked to see you in his study."
Antoine found the Count looking frailer than ever, wrapped in blankets despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Mademoiselle Dufour stood beside him, her expression concerned. On the Count's desk lay a document, elegant paper covered in legal language.
"Monsieur Roussel," the Count began without preamble,
"I am dying. The doctors give me perhaps a month, possibly 2.
Before I go, I must make provisions for the collection."
Antoine started to offer condolences, but the Count waved him silent.
"I've lived long enough to grow tired of living. But these objects, Mercier's works, they must be protected. I'm offering you a position as permanent curator of the Mercier collection. The salary would be generous, enough to support your brother's family and establish Pierre in his own workshop when he's ready." The offer was extraordinary. Security, prestige, a lifetime's work studying objects that challenged the very boundaries of art and science. Yet Antoine hesitated.
"What troubles you?"
Mademoiselle Dufour asked perceptively. Antoine chose his words carefully. "The responsibility, mademoiselle. To be guardian of such things, it's not just preserving objects, but preserving secrets. And I wonder if some secrets shouldn't be preserved." The Count smiled sadly. "You're thinking of destroying them." "The thought had occurred to me," Antoine admitted.
What Mercier created, it's wonderful, but also terrible. The portrait alone has driven men to madness and theft. What might happen if his techniques were rediscovered, replicated with modern methods?
"You could publish everything," Mademoiselle Dufour suggested. "Make the knowledge public, remove its power as a secret."
"And have every charlatan in Europe claiming to create living portraits?" the Count countered. "No. Secrets have power precisely because they're secret. The question is whether that power is used for good or ill." They were interrupted by Marie Claire, who entered carrying a tea service. As she arranged the cups, she spoke quietly.
"If I may, Your Excellency, perhaps the answer isn't to preserve or destroy, but to transform."
All eyes turned to her. She continued with growing confidence.
Monsieur Roussel has learned Mercier's techniques. He could create new works that capture the beauty of the method without its darker aspects.
Art that honors the past while moving beyond it. Antoine felt something shift in his thinking. Continue the tradition, but change its nature.
"Precisely," Marie-Claire said. "My grandmother always said that true preservation wasn't keeping things unchanged, but helping them evolve appropriately." The Count leaned back, considering. "You would become not just a curator, but an artist in your own right." Antoine thought of the wig he'd been planning, not a copy of Mercier's work, but something inspired by it, using modern understanding to create beauty without the terrible cost Celeste had paid. "I would need freedom to work as I see fit." "Granted," the Count said immediately. "The position would be yours to shape." "And Pierre would be my assistant and eventual successor?" "If he proves worthy." "What of Mademoiselle Dufour and Marie-Claire?" The Count smiled. "Mademoiselle Dufour will manage the estate for my nephew. He's already agreed, knowing he has no head for such things."
Marie-Claire will continue her work with the portrait, which must remain with the house. Antoine made his decision. "Then I accept, with conditions. The most dangerous pieces, anything that required human essence in its creation, will be sealed away, studied, but never displayed. I'll create new works using safer techniques, pieces that capture Mercier's vision without his methods. And everything will be documented for future generations to judge with greater wisdom than we possess." "Agreed," the Count said, extending his hand. They shook, and Antoine felt the weight of centuries passing between them. That afternoon, Antoine began his first original work, a mourning piece commissioned by the Count himself. It would incorporate hair, as was traditional, but treated with methods that preserved without imprisoning, that honored the dead without trying to resurrect them. Marie-Claire found him working as evening approached.
"The portrait seems different today," she said.
"Calmer somehow, as if it knows its secrets are safe." "Do you believe it's conscious?" Antoine asked, genuinely curious about her opinion. "Not conscious as we understand it, but aware, perhaps, in the way a flower is aware of the sun. It responds without thinking, exists without choosing." She paused at the door. "That's the difference between Mercier's tragedy and your opportunity. He tried to capture consciousness itself. You can capture beauty without the soul." Alone again, Antoine continued his work, carefully knotting each strand of hair into the foundation. He thought about his brother Francois, who would be relieved by the financial security this position offered. About Pierre, whose future was now assured if he proved himself worthy. About his late wife, whose memory he carried without trying to preserve her physically. The Count had asked him to create a piece that would commemorate the Montmorency line without the dark obsession that had marked Mercier's work.
Antoine was developing a technique that created depth and movement through purely mechanical means, overlapping layers of different hair textures that would shift with air currents, creating an illusion of life without any organic preservation.
"Master," Pierre said, entering with a letter, "this just arrived from Dr. Bergman." The German scholar wrote that he'd reached Berlin safely and had shared his findings with colleagues at the academy. They were skeptical but intrigued. He ended with a warning. "Others will come seeking Mercier's secrets. The academic world has a way of ferreting out mysteries. Be prepared to defend your choices. Antoine set the letter aside. Let them come. He would share what was safe to share, demonstrate techniques that pushed the boundaries of art without crossing into the dangerous territory Mercier had explored.
The real secrets, the formulas, the combinations of organic materials, the methods of embedding life essence into art, those would remain with him and his chosen successors. As night fell, he made his final decision about Mercier's wig. It would be preserved, but never worn, studied, but never replicated. It would stand as both achievement and warning, a reminder of what humans could accomplish when genius met obsession, and what price they might pay for transcending natural limits. November brought gray skies and persistent rain that drummed against the windows of Antoine's Paris workshop. He had returned 3 weeks ago, after the Count's funeral, a dignified affair attended by what remained of the old nobility and a surprising number of servants who genuinely mourned their master's passing. The Count had died as he lived, with quiet dignity and perfect timing, waiting until all arrangements were complete before surrendering to the inevitable. Antoine stood before his workbench, no longer the same man who had received the Montmorency commission 2 months prior. The workshop looked identical, the same wig stands, the same tools, the same view of the baker's shop across the street where Pierre's beloved worked. Yet everything had changed. Pierre himself was transformed, working with the focused intensity of someone who had found his calling. The boy, though Antoine supposed he should stop thinking of him as a boy, was creating a wedding wig for a banker's daughter, each knot perfect, each strand aligned with mathematical precision. The romance with Mademoiselle Fournier continued its proper courtship, but Pierre no longer let it distract him from his craft.
"Master," Pierre said without looking up, "the preservation solution needs refreshing."
Antoine smiled. The apprentice had developed an instinct for the work, knowing by sound and smell when materials needed attention. It was a good sign. When Pierre was ready, perhaps in another year or 2, he would share with him the deeper mysteries he'd learned at the chateau. The Mercier wig sat in its special case, climate-controlled and monitored, a reminder of possibilities and dangers. Antoine had already received 3 offers to purchase it, each more extravagant than the last. He'd refused them all. Some things weren't meant for the marketplace. Instead, he'd begun creating what he privately called living wigs, pieces that seemed to breathe and move without any organic preservation. The secret was in the construction, using different weights and textures of hair that responded differently to air currents and static electricity. The effect was mesmerizing without being supernatural, beautiful without being dangerous. His brother François had wept when Antoine told him about the position with the Montmorency estate. The security meant proper doctors, good food, education for the children.
François' eldest boy showed promise as a carpenter, following his father's original trade. The family line would continue, each generation building on the last. A knock at the door interrupted his musings. Marie-Claire entered, dressed in traveling clothes, but carrying herself with new authority. The Count's nephew had wisely retained her as special curator for the portrait, and she'd come to Paris to report on its condition. "It remains stable," she said, accepting the chair Antoine offered. "The new owner is appropriately respectful. He treats it as art, not mystery, which perhaps is for the best." "And you continue your midnight vigils?" "When necessary.
So I've trained 2 assistants in basic maintenance. The secret spreads but thins, like butter over too much bread.
In time, it will become mere tradition, then legend, then nothing at all. They discussed technical matters, temperature controls, humidity levels, the new preservation techniques Antoine had developed that achieved Mercier's effects without his methods. Marie-Claire had proved an apt student, her natural intelligence finally given proper scope.
"There's something else," she said as she prepared to leave. "I've been accepted at the Academy of Fine Arts, not as a student, women aren't permitted that, but as a technical assistant specializing in restoration. It's a start." Antoine felt genuine pleasure at the news. The art world needs more people who understand that preservation is itself an art. After she left, Antoine returned to his current project, a memorial piece for a widow who wanted to remember her husband without morbidity. He was incorporating the man's hair into an abstract pattern that suggested, rather than depicted, honored without imprisoning.
It was, he realized, what all good memorial art should do: help the living process grief rather than deny death. The years passed like pages turning in a book, each season bringing its own challenges and revelations. 20 years later, in November of 1893, an elderly Antoine sat in the same workshop, though now it was 3 times larger and employed 6 craftsmen. Pierre had his own establishment on the Champs-Élysées, catering to the theater world with spectacular creations that seemed to defy gravity. The letter informing him of the Montmorency Chateau's sale to an American industrialist lay on his desk. The new owner wanted to modernize everything, install electric lights, telephone lines, all the conveniences of the approaching new century. But the portrait would remain. It was, after all, too valuable to move and too famous to sell. Antoine decided to make one final pilgrimage. Despite his 72 years, the journey to the chateau felt shorter than it had 2 decades ago, perhaps because he knew exactly what awaited him. The portrait hung in the same spot, now protected by a velvet rope and a discreet sign requesting visitors not to touch. The American industrialist had opened the house to paid tours, turning mystery into commodity. Yet Madame Celeste remained unchanged, her hair still catching light in that impossible way, still shifting color with the seasons. Antoine stood before it as the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows. A young guide was explaining to a group of tourists that the portrait's unusual properties came from the artist's innovative use of layered glazes. A perfectly reasonable explanation that happened to be completely wrong, yet somehow also right. The truth had become optional, subordinate to the story people preferred to believe.
It's beautiful,
a young woman in the tour group said. She looks so alive. That was the artist's intention, the guide replied smoothly, to capture life itself.
Antoine smiled. Mercier had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams and darkest nightmares. He had captured life, or something like it, creating art that existed in the boundary between living and dead, real and imagined, truth and legend. As he turned to leave, Antoine caught a glimpse of movement in the portrait, not the hair this time, but something in the eyes, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or merely the play of light on old varnish. He chose to believe it was Madame Celeste herself, acknowledging a fellow keeper of secrets, a fellow artist who understood that beauty's price was always higher than expected, but sometimes worth paying anyway. Outside, the autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter. Antoine pulled his coat closer and began the journey home. In his pocket was a small vial of preservation solution, Marie Claire's final gift.
He would never use it, but he kept it as a reminder that some knowledge was meant to be preserved, not for its utility, but for its possibility. The train back to Paris was full of young people discussing the coming century, the wonders that awaited. Electric everything, flying machines, pictures that moved. Antoine listened with amusement. They had no idea that the future's greatest mysteries might not be in what was yet to be discovered, but in what had already been forgotten. Techniques and knowledge that belonged to a world where the boundary between art and magic was gossamer thin. In his workshop that evening, Antoine opened the case containing Mercier's wig one last time. It remained perfect, unchanged, a testament to its creator's genius and madness. He would leave instructions for its preservation, ensuring it would survive long after he was gone. Someone in the future might unlock its remaining secrets, or perhaps it would simply endure as beautiful enigma, proof that humans had once reached for immortality and briefly, terribly, magnificently grasped it. Antoine closed the case and turned to his workbench, where his current project waited. A simple theatrical wig that would help an actor become someone else for a few hours each night. It was humble work compared to Mercier's ambitions, but it was honest, and it was his. As he began to work, knotting each strand with practiced precision, Antoine reflected that perhaps this was the true lesson of Madame Celeste's portrait, that the desire to preserve beauty was itself beautiful, even when it failed. Every wig he made was an attempt to capture something ephemeral, youth, beauty, a moment in time. The difference was that he knew these were temporary victories against entropy, and that knowledge made them sweeter, not bitter. The workshop was quiet, except for the whisper of hair through his fingers and the distant sounds of Paris settling into sleep. Tomorrow there would be new orders, new challenges, new attempts to create beauty from the remnants of what had been. But tonight, Antoine Roussel worked in peaceful solitude, a master of his craft who had learned that the greatest mysteries were not meant to be solved, but to be tended, like gardens that bloomed in the space between sleeping and waking, between memory and dream.